Tonight, I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the book, explain a little bit about what social prescribing is, and my hope is that by the end of it, and particularly when we get our amazing panel up here, you'll say, yeah, I do that, or I want to do that, or I totally see why we should do that. I am a journalist. Like I said, I am not a doctor. I, don't work in the faith community, but I started writing this book in the midst of COVID when it became really clear just how negative isolation was for our health, how the health consequences of loneliness. Some stats actually suggest loneliness is as bad for your health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So I became really curious about the opposite. What would it look like if we prescribed connection? And it turns out in the UK, in a revolution that actually began in a church, which I'll talk a bit more about, doctors are starting to do this in something called social prescribing. So let's talk about what that is. So it turns out that 80% of our health outcomes are driven by our social and environmental factors. And that includes everything from access to green space, things like the strength of our libraries, shout out to this library, things like access to social support, outlets to cope with stress. Only 20% of our health outcomes actually comes down to what happens in the doctor's office. And it turns out that for most of human history, we sort of had these social and environmental factors built in for us. If we needed to get food, we had to move our bodies. If we wanted to build shelter, find water, we had to pay attention to nature. And above all, we had to survive with the group. And so, of course, that meant lots of storytelling. That meant lots of forms of service and mutual aid. And it meant feeling a sense of belonging with this group. And it's probably no wonder why, on a physiological level, when we're given access to these 5 pillars, movement, nature, art, service, and belonging, so much research suggests that this is really good for us. So, for example, moving our bodies, we know, has been linked with increases in serotonin and endorphins, right? Neurochemicals associated with mood. We also know that moving our bodies is associated with increased hippocampus size. That's the part of the brain associated with memory. So if you go for a run and you find yourself feeling really sharp after, that's why. Exposure to nature, the book really gets into this, has incredible effects on all kinds of our systems. We know that forest bathing, for example, engaging in a forest environment with all 5 senses, has been linked to an increase in your natural killer cells, which are associated with increased immune function. We know that it's associated with a reduction in cortisol and blood pressure, and also less activity in your subgenual prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain associated with rumination, which is highly linked with anxiety and depression. These benefits also hold for engaging with art. And I think of particular significance to people in this room, particularly those who work in the faith community. There's so much research suggesting that service and having a sense of purpose and feeling like you have a community you can belong to and contribute to, this too has some really profound health benefits. One of my favorites is this 80-year-old study from Harvard University where they followed the same group of 80 people of people for 80 years. And they found that the number one factor that most influenced longevity was the strength of a person's relationships. Did they feel like they had meaningful relationships? Did they feel like they belonged to a community? The same is true for having a sense of purpose. This too associated with decreased mortality across lots of different metrics. So that's a bit about the nerdy science. But it turns out that our environments today often don't support these needs for movement, nature, art, service, and belonging. In fact, there's virtually nothing we need to survive that we can't get with access that we can get through access to our smartphones. If we want to be entertained, if we want food, if we need a ride, if we want some sort of synthetic connection, all of that we can get through our phones. And so our healthcare system is noticing this. 50% of adults, US adults, fail to meet physical activity guidelines. Almost half experience stress. Almost half have reported symptoms of anxiety or depression or loneliness. And in turn, 60% of adults have at least one chronic health condition and 40% have at least too. Now, our healthcare systems, particularly in the aftermath of COVID, have not been able to keep up with this demand. Some studies show 67% of physicians have experienced burnout. 66% of people can't access a mental health specialist. 70% of US adults take at least one prescription drug. And we're also seeing really interesting data that there's a really high correlation between loneliness and isolation and emergency room usage. One study even suggests that loneliness increases your risk of ER visits by 50%. And I'll tell you one quick story. I heard about this on my tour. I was talking to somebody who worked at a hospital, and he said that this man would always come in every week, but only on Friday nights. Friday night, it was the same thing. This man checked into the emergency room. And so finally he asked the man, he said, "Why is it that you only come in on Friday nights?" And the man told him, he said, "If I were alone at the weekend, I don't know what I'd do with myself." So that's really sad. But this is an uplifting presentation because actually social prescribing aims to address this and lots of other conditions. It's an approach through which people working in healthcare are actually referring people to community activities and resources the same way they'd refer them to pills and therapies. Now, this is not a replacement for pills and therapies, like Cheryl said. This is all part of the healthcare equation. But this is about understanding that health is not just about treating our symptoms, it's also about creating lasting sources of wellness. And to show you what I mean, I'll tell you about a fictitious patient named John. Let's say you meet John, a healthcare provider meets John, and John reports symptoms like fatigue, like back pain, like low mood. That healthcare provider would be right to try to understand, what's the matter with you? Tell me about those symptoms. Tell me about the precise nature of those symptoms so I can prescribe you something to treat them. And in doing so, the healthcare provider might prescribe John painkillers, antidepressants, maybe back surgery. But more and more healthcare providers are also asking the other side of that question. What matters to you? And in that conversation, they might learn that John used to love music, and it was something he played every day with his wife until she passed away recently. And they might notice that even in that conversation of what matters to you, that I'm sure you experience often at Silver Hill and your church, John's whole face lights up. And based on that very different conversation, the provider might prescribe John a violin and a spot in the local orchestra. Now, it should be noted that social prescribing is, you might be nodding your heads and saying, we do this. And that's good, because it's true that even though social prescribing may be a new term, lots of different healthcare systems have recognized that our health is in part socially determined. These ideas go back to indigenous cultures, they go back to Eastern medicine, things like lifestyle medicine and integrative medicine and positive psychology all recognize that our health is also a product of our connections. But this is a book about what would it look like if more of healthcare started actually taking this seriously. So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories. I probably will skip a few so we have more time for the panel. But just to show you, what does this actually look like in practice? So I met a real life version of John. His name was Frank. And Frank was a truck driver. And, for most of his life, he'd been overweight and he'd struggled with type 2 diabetes. And he was prescribed insulin and told he was going to be on insulin for the rest of his life. He was also told things like, you need to work out more, you need to eat healthier, all of which were probably true. But for somebody like Frank, who was working in this sedentary job, didn't know a lot of people, didn't have a lot of outlets to do that, that advice actually made him feel worse and made him want to avoid the doctor. But then he ends up meeting a different kind of doctor who asks a version of what matters to you. What's something you loved to do as a kid but haven't done since? And that's when he learns that Frank loves cycling. And based on that love, the doctor, Dr. Ollie Hart, actually prescribes Frank a spot in a cycling course designed for people like him, over 50, who haven't been biking in years, and a bicycle. And in doing so, he'd offered him a social prescription. And over time, Frank, not only loses 40 pounds, he's able to come off his insulin, but most importantly, at the end of this 10-week course, he ends up becoming really good friends with the people he was prescribed the course with. So much so that he starts his own little group chat with them. They call themselves the Chain Gang, and they continue cycling together at the weekends. Now Frank volunteers at Diabetes UK and talks about the ways that social prescriptions can actually help people like him. It was not that he didn't know exercise was good for him. It's that he didn't have that extra motivation and accountability to actually do something about it. So this is a picture of the Chain Gang. So I'll tell you one more quick story because you might be thinking, sure, that makes sense. Physical activity for type 2 diabetes. What about mental health? Well, that's when I met Amanda. And Amanda was diagnosed with clinical depression after she had what she called her big five happen to her. She found out her husband was having an affair, so she got divorced. Her mother passed away. She lost her job. She had to move to a town where she knew nobody. And this was all in the backdrop of COVID itself. So she was very suddenly disconnected from all of these sources of connection that mattered to her. So Amanda was prescribed the maximum dose of antidepressant, and this really helped her. It's able to help her with her most severe symptoms. But she'd been in this sort of in-between where she felt like, okay, in some ways she was feeling better, but she still felt like her mind was caught in a helmet, is how she described it. She couldn't get let go of these negative thoughts. And so that's when Amanda's mental health nurse encourages her to investigate social prescribing. She too asks her a version of what matters to you. And that's when she learns that Amanda was really curious about swimming. She'd actually just moved to this seaside town in England, right near Devon, if any of folks have been there. But Amanda, like Frank, hadn't been swimming in years, wouldn't know where to begin. And so that mental health nurse prescribes her a spot in these chill therapy swimming lessons. The chill is literal. They do these sea swims together 365 days a year. And in the course of these swimming lessons, some people are thinking, that's not for me. But in the course of these swimming lessons, Amanda has a similar outcome to Frank. She goes from the maximum dose of antidepressant to the minimum dose. She makes these wonderful friends who she meets up with on the weekends to not only swim, but also have tea and make sandwiches and do all kinds of British things. And in that, she says, my life became bright again. When I was so down with depression, I had to convince myself every day, why do I want to wake up? She said this is what gave her the motivation, knowing that there were people waiting for her. And of course, we have all those physiological benefits of movement and nature, exposure to this beautiful sea. But it was really the belonging, I think, that did it for Amanda. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip these other examples, but you should check them out in the book because you're probably wondering, this is all well and good in the UK, but what is it actually going to look like in the US? And you'd be right to ask this question because that was certainly my question. As we know, England has a nationalized healthcare system. They have more of an incentive, perhaps, to invest in social prescriptions. But could this ever happen in the US? And the answer is yes. But before we get there, I want to explain generally what this looks like in the UK, because maybe some of you who work with Silver Hill or work in healthcare might be thinking, that sounds great, but how did Frank's doctor know that there was cycling lessons available on prescription? How did he get him the bike? In many cases, what happens is it's actually not the initial health provider who's doing the social prescribing. Sometimes it is, depending on the practice, but generally what happens is the health provider screens the patient as they would, in any other sort of healthcare consultation. And if they detect that maybe this person is struggling with loneliness, maybe this person could use a bit more connection in their life, they actually refer them to another health worker. In many cases, this is called the link worker. A link worker gets its name because it's sort of this link between the healthcare office and the community. So they spend half of their week going around to see what kind of, community organizations are available to be prescribed. Very excited to hear from the new Canaan Community Foundation about this. And then based on that link worker also has more time than the initial doctor to get to know what matters to the patient. So instead of a 15-minute consultation, it's going to be more like a 60-minute consultation. Then based on that conversation, they'll tend to offer a prescription for something like the swimming lessons or the cycling course. Tends to be about 8 to 12 weeks. And then the hope is that by the end of this course, as was true for Frank and Amanda, the person will have developed their own community, adopted healthier habits, now have people and an activity holding them accountable to be healthier, and that they won't need as much healthcare in the future. So this was sort of the original model in the UK. And if there's time in the panel, I could talk about the cool origin story of how this all actually began in a church in the 1980s. Across the UK, the general gist of it is that it's focused around this question, what matters to you? So to those of you who said, yeah, swimming prescription, not for me, don't worry, that's not what social prescribing is. It's very much tailored to a person's unique interests. It's co-produced between the health worker and the patient. So again, no one's going to be forcing social prescriptions on somebody who doesn't want it. And it's considering a person's holistic needs. So for example, if you don't have a bicycle, it's also considering getting you access to a bicycle. If you don't have transportation to get to your social prescription, it's considering that as well. And why would the UK do this? Why would they invest in hiring link workers? Why would they, as they are now, invest in these community organizations? It turns out that this has really profound effects on people's health and their healthcare system. So in pilots where this has been tried, it's been shown that social prescribing improves people's self-esteem, confidence, mood. It reduces their anxiety and depression and loneliness, improves their overall mental health. But important for them, it dramatically reduces pressure on healthcare. You think about that Friday night lonely emergency room visitor. Imagine if the person could have just offered him a social prescription. Or maybe a social prescription and something else, right? It's not about taking away other healthcare options. But it's been found that in places where there is social prescribing, it leads to a massive reduction in the number of doctor's appointments, in pressure on emergency room. And over time, this actually saves money. Because again, think about somebody like Frank, who was told he was going to be on insulin for the rest of his life. After that 10-week social prescription, and after that inspired Frank to be more accountable, to exercise more, had motivation to do it, Frank is no longer needing that medication. So these are just some of the ways that social prescribing saves money. They've seen similar results in Canada, because you might be thinking, yeah, England, that's nice, but pretty tiny. How is this going to work in a big country? Well, Canada has seen similar results, fewer hospital admissions, emergency room visits, ambulance calls. And this is part of the reason why versions of social prescribing have spread to 32 countries, including the US. So, real quick. Generally, what this looks like in the US, and has historically looked like, is first sort of these screeners for non-medical needs. There was a program that piloted at Boston Medical Center called Health Leads. And that was a program through which the hospital basically staffed the hospital with students to serve as volunteers, as in a sort of help desk capacity. And let's say they had a patient who really needed access to fresh produce, or really needed help with transportation, or really needed translations, for example. It was the student help desk that would take on those sort of non-medical needs, in some ways kind of serving like a link worker. And even though this model, this Health Leads model, has changed a bit over the years, it's been found that this increases patients' confidence, it improves their access to essential resources, all of which over time lead to better health outcomes. Another example, it's a bit more widespread in the US, is a program called Unite Us. So this is sort of a platform through which people working in healthcare can actually directly refer people to, again, food support, job assistance, transportation. And, I'll be honest, I don't think Unite Us is quite there in the way that England is. And it's not as robust in terms of the more social connection-based activities, but in terms of basic resources, this is a great initiative. And it's also been found that places with Unite Us, when this technology's been used, it leads to an increase in perceived social support, a reduction in stress, an increase of 4 mentally healthy days per month. So again, painting the picture that when we give people access to their non-medical social needs, their health improves. Now, a program that I really love and I talk about in the book is this wonderful program coming out of the VA. It's called the Compassionate Contact Corps. And what it is it's a program that pairs veterans who are dealing with loneliness with a volunteer phone call buddy. And that phone call buddy is trained by a social worker to actually get to, ask questions that really make the veteran feel heard, really get to know their interests. And there's a really heartwarming story about this in the book, but the data on this program shows that veterans who pass through it report increased well-being, report less loneliness, and also the volunteers do as well. So this is a great example of a program where you actually don't need a bicycle or a C to foster social connection. There are examples of doing this virtually as well. Similarly, in California, there's a great program called Community as Medicine, and this is a program in which health coaches are paired with patients through the YMCA to try to connect them to more opportunities for movement and social connection and nature. And it's been found that this too, over time, leads to a reduction in ER visits, depression, social isolation, blood pressure, and an increase in physical activity. Another program I love because of the way that its model is so spreadable is called Walk with a Doc. So this was started in 2005 by this cardiologist in Ohio who was basically sick of having conversations with people like Frank, people who had health conditions that were manageable with lifestyle changes. And he would say, guys, you need to exercise more, you need to make friends, you need to increase your access to nature. And finally, he just said, you know what? I'm taking you with me. Come meet me in the park this Saturday. Me and my wife are going for a walk. And sure enough, his patients did join him. At that first walk, he had almost 100 patients come. It became a weekly tradition. It's now spread to over 500 chapters around the world, this model, Walk with a Doc. And this too really increases patients' health over time by increasing their physical activity and increasing their confidence and education about their health. Okay, and one more, or maybe two more, just because they're fairly close to us here in Connecticut, is this great program called Come Alive Outside. This is a program sponsored with Rutland Community Health and a local nonprofit called Come Alive Outside that leads these weekly nature excursions. Here too, it's been found that families who receive a prescription for this nature program increase their physical activity, increase their well-being, increase their time outdoors. And also, some of you might have heard the news that, because just this month, it's expanded to Connecticut, but there's a national program called Art Pharmacy that's trying to pair with insurers and managed care plans to actually be able to offer people art prescriptions through their care plan. Massachusetts was one of the first to really go big on this. And based on that initial success, it led to a program in New Jersey that's a partnership between Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield and the New Jersey Performing Arts Center, which means, yes, literally patients who have Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield are at risk of overspending on their insurance get prescribed art classes and, glass blowing workshops and all this programming through New Jersey Performing Arts. Now Art Pharmacy is trying to scale this, and I think, just a couple weeks ago, announced a new partnership in Connecticut. Sorry I didn't include a slide about that. All this to say, and this is really what the book gets into as well, it's great that our healthcare systems are starting to adopt this. Many have, without even calling it social prescribing. But I think ultimately this is going to take a cultural shift as well, and that's ultimately what I come to realize in the book. That we need to start talking about movement, nature, art, service, and belonging the same way we talk about broccoli and other elements of building good health. So to that end, I'm going to encourage all of you before we leave to reflect on what matters to you. It's easy for us, especially, in this economy and in this world, to be fixated on our stress and to be reminded of our triggers and to ruminate on things that have gone wrong. But this shift from what's the matter with you to what matters to you is something we can adopt in our own lives as well. So instead of just focusing on rumination, right, the thing like Amanda that's stuck in your head, the negative thoughts, think about when was the last time you experienced awe, something that gave you a sense of wonder. Or instead of thinking about, your endless to-do list and all the things that are begging for your attention, think about something you do, an activity that captures your attention. Something that no matter what, you are in the zone, focused on this thing, and nothing could take you away from that. And instead of just thinking about your triggers, also think about your glimmers. What are small things that have happened to you in the last week, the last month, that have sparked a sense of joy in you? Lots of other questions you can ask that get to this what matters to you. Something you loved to do as a kid but haven't had a chance to do since. Something you're curious about here in New Canaan and haven't had a chance to explore. Something that makes you light up when you talk about it, like it did for fictitious John. Something that if you had 2 more hours in your week, and you can't say sleeping, what would you spend it doing? Asking ourselves these kind of questions, really giving us time to think about them, I think is part of the equation in how we start building not just a healthcare system that encourages more connection, but a culture that does as well. So if you'd like to explore some more of these questions and maybe get some inspiration on what can you prescribe yourself, I encourage you to check out the book website, www.socialprescribing.co. It's got all these testimonies and examples of real organizations around the country that embody these 5 pillars. I'm sure by the end of tonight, I'm going to have to add a lot that are based in New Canaan. I'm really excited for our panel. But in the meantime, I hope that you feel inspired by this. And I hope you see that this social prescribing leap, even though at least when I started reporting on this, I said there's no way this would happen in U.S. healthcare. But I hope you feel that this is a bit more manageable, not just in our healthcare, but also in our own lives. So thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Julia. Thank you for a phenomenal talk and an amazing book. Let me introduce myself. I'm Andrew Gerber. I'm the president and medical director at Silver Hill Hospital. I see lots of familiar faces in the audience. Thank you for being here tonight. So as I'm thinking about what you shared with us, Julia, it makes me think there are 2 ways to look at the world. One way is to look at the world as a competition for resources. And I think we hear about that a lot in our lives. It comes to mind even when you hear about digital marketing. You hear people say about the competition for eyeballs. How are people going to spend their time on this app or on this video streaming or somewhere else? But of course, there's another way to look at the world, and I think listening to you inspires me in that direction, which is an abundance of things, and how do things work together? And I say that as an intro because the 3 of us who are up here today, I think, in other generations, or maybe even in other communities, could be seen as in competition with one another, right? I run a psychiatric hospital, Lauren runs a community foundation, and Chapin is the lead pastor in a church, right? So you could see these as 3 different places that people might go. But I think what brings us together is the belief that by working together, we're vastly stronger and we're vastly healthier for our community because of the way each one of the things we do matters. So I say that as a kind of framing statement because you're going to hear from all 3 of us tonight about, I believe, the ways that social prescribing makes so much sense to us. And maybe we didn't have the term, but hopefully we had some of the ideas. And with your help and the help of others that you're inspiring, Julia, there's more we can do to work together. So on that note, I'm going to start with you, Lauren, and I'm going to give a quick introduction. Lauren, who I wouldn't need to read from it, but I'm going to read a little bit. Lauren Patterson has been the president and CEO of the New Canaan Community Foundation since 2016. Since that time, she has launched key initiatives, including both short-term work like a COVID response fund and multi-year work focused on community-wide strategies to improve behavioral health. And I'll tell you that when I first moved to this community 6.5 years ago, one of the first experiences I had of New Canaan was meeting Lauren around how she had gathered us together, even prior to COVID, around how we could work together for the community's mental health, and was really inspired to watch how you did that. Lauren has nearly 20 years of experience in community philanthropy, previously leading programmatic and philanthropic work at both a community foundation and a women's foundation in the DC region. So I'm going to start with you, Lauren, and invite you to comment on Julia's wonderful talk.
Sure. Thank you for having me. I've learned tonight that I could be described as a link worker. Yes. I'm going to start saying that now because I think community foundations are strange animals. We bring people together, we bring organizations together, we bring resources together, both financial, but most importantly, I think human capital and social capital. One of the things that we're known for in town is that every year we kind of amass dollars from across the community, different families chip in, and then we have nonprofit organizations through a very open, transparent process put in requests for support. This past year, we had 116 applications, right? So we're seeing things all over Lower Fairfield County. But what's really critical is that this is entirely then powered by a volunteer corps. So there's more than 100 people across the community that then look at all of those organizations, and they make an assessment as community members with their own perspectives, their own passions, their own professional backgrounds, their lives. What is the best application of our community's collective resources? Now, I point this out specifically because in terms of the link worker, we get so many calls, and I love this, of people that say, I just moved here from, you name it, Cincinnati. I used to be really civically engaged there. Or my kids are graduating from high school and I have all this time on my hands now, and I didn't ever get to do the civic stuff in town that I wanted to, or I want to understand the local landscape of nonprofits. So we end up playing this link worker role. It is how people are finding volunteer opportunities in town, or they're connecting or expanding some philanthropic passions. And I love your introduction, Andrew, that in previous generations we could have been seen as competition. I mean, I see this as not a zero-sum game. People are always saying, well, what if you introduce someone to so-and-so organization and they go off I'm like, great, let them go off there. I think people have it in their hearts to add, and I don't think there's always a trade-off. And I think that is something that I see is truly remarkable in New Canaan. I grew up in northern New Jersey, so not in New Canaan, but in a community a lot like this. I've been here now, 9 years. It kind of hits you in the face in such a wonderful way how engaged people are in our community, which is fabulous, but you also, I think, see that some of that does take time, right? And so I'd want to call out one example. This past fall, there was an alliance of 40 plus organizations in town, so again, like that great community fabric. The New Canaan Behavioral Health Alliance administered our town's first community health and well-being survey. So we asked traditional things like, do you have access to the physical health care you need, the mental health care you need? But we also asked, how long have you lived in town? Are you part of civic and religious groups? How would you rank your stress and anxiety levels? What concerns do you have about your children or your family members? And largely people are doing well. But if you're newer to town, right, you have not built up that social capital and that civic infrastructure here yet, right? So there's some more we can do there, even though I will say newcomers in town is the most fabulous thing, and people will still talk about the friends they've got from that group. But that survey showed, there are areas where if you're newer to town, or there are certain subpopulations, and I count myself in here, so it's not exclusionary, but there are certain subpopulations that called out higher stress and anxiety levels, or lower financial security, or more stress and anxiety. And those were women in the 30 to 59 age group, generally parents, multiple caregivers, so those who had a child under 27 living at home, but also were a primary caregiver for a parent or a spouse or another family member, and then those who self-described as being having lower financial security. And I think the important implication for our community is these are people in our community, including us in this room, that have less resources in the way of time or money for some of these social connections. And so I think there's great stuff going on in town, but I'm encouraged and motivated to think about reaching people additionally in those spaces.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lauren. I love your example too, because I think it's such an illustration of where communication and knowledge makes it possible for communities to then support one another. And the flip side of that is communities that are afraid to talk about this or afraid to actually look at the data are less likely to actually reach out and connect. So I'm going to move on to Chapin. So the Reverend Dr. Stephen Chapin Garner is senior pastor at the Congregational Church of New Canaan. Chapin is a graduate of Boston University School of Theology and also holds a Doctor of Ministry degree in preaching. He has served as a pastor at the Village Church in Wellesley, Massachusetts, and the United Church of Christ in Norwell, Massachusetts. Chapin currently leads the Raymond Preaching Fellowship Program for churches in Connecticut. I want to add, just on a personal note, just recently, on a last minute, we needed a space for holding a town meeting for our hospital. And the Congregational Church responded immediately. And part of that's due to Barb Clayton and part due to you. And I just want to say what an amazing thing that is to feel that all the institutions of the town support one another and create those spaces. So we'd love to give you a chance now to comment on.
Yeah, well, first of all, what a great book. So hopeful, so helpful. And again, I know so many of us feel this way. What an amazing community we're a part of, where so many people do work together. And I just say that, maybe I'm up here representing some of the clergy and churches and religious organizations in town, but what I like is that even those organizations, we really do work together. Good friends, and we feel like we're all on the same page so much of the time. I think in my perspective, a church or a religious organization at its best does really two things. It does faith formation and community building. So we really strive to connect people to purpose and connect people to others. And that's what we strive to do. So this whole social prescribing thing, love it. Okay, you've given it a new name, I think, or a name, and it's I think at our best what we try to do, and not just our church, but all the religious and faith communities in the area. And I think that one of the things we try to do always is think about programs that aren't in place yet for communities that lack connection. I was thinking about maybe an area where we have taken particular initiative, where there was a need that we recognized that we wanted to address. And I was thinking about our men's ministry at church. Many of you know that there's really an epidemic of loneliness and isolation among men, and a shocking percentage of men who can't point to a single individual as a close personal friend, someone that they can actually share their life with. And so years ago, I think it was like 8 years ago, we had a men's ministry, and it did kind of like typical things, like we had a golf outing, or we had a men's barbecue or men's breakfast, and we had a meeting, just eight or so leaders around the table, and we said, I guess the conversation started with, how do we get more guys to these events, And then it came up, well, what about, instead of trying to get more people at the events, what if as men we tried to go deeper with the guys? And so that group of 6 or 8 guys decided covenanted for a year to get together and share their lives with one another. In fact, try to resist the temptation to go out and do something, but actually spend time talking with one another. And after a year of doing that, the group doubled and then doubled again. And now we have over like 100 guys that get together for small group ministry. And we had our meetings last night, and I just kind of pinched myself as these guys were being like really vulnerable with I think our topic last night was persistence through suffering. And God, I grew up in this area, so I always viewed this as the land of veneer, shiny on the outside, maybe not all that well put together on the inside. And here were these guys who were willing to talk about the divorce, the job loss, the health diagnosis that they got. And I have found, at least in our community of faith, guys that lean into those relationships tend to do better in moments of crisis, and the guys who can't quite make it into the group really struggle. So this social prescribing, it's a real thing, and in the Christian tradition, I believe we've been doing it for 2,000 years. But now it's good to have a real official title. So thank you for that, Julia.
That's great. Thank you, Chapin. Well, I'm going to go last, then I'll be quick, but then I'm going to turn it back over to you, Julia, and then also open it up for questions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of our hospital. Some of you may have heard this before, but things that people may not know is that when Silver Hill was founded in 1931, it was an extraordinarily unusual idea that a psychiatric or addiction hospital would be located in a community. And even today, somebody might say, why would you do that? Shouldn't you put people who have an illness far away? That's what used to be done 100 years ago. You would put people who had addiction or mental illness in rural communities as far from communities as possible, because it was scary and it was stigma-based. And people were afraid to imagine that those people could be within our community. And the founder of Silver Hill, who was first a psychiatrist named John Millett and another named William Terhune, both of whom lived here in town, were part of a new movement. It was a movement actually originally started by a man named Austin Riggs up in Massachusetts, who said, no, that's exactly who you need to put in our community. Because it's our communities that support one another, both for the health of the patients who need to be part of a community, not just their own community, but part of a wider community, but also for the health of everybody else. Because for exactly the reasons I think that have been alluded to, these areas are in all our family. And if we banish it, we're sending the message that we can't talk about that we have to pretend, that we have to use that veneer. And if we have it in our midst, it becomes part of our daily conversation, that challenges, vulnerabilities, suffering are part of the human condition, but we can get through those by being in a community together. So when Silver Hill was founded, part of the regimen was being outside, doing a lot of the things, again, that you now describe as social prescribing, which I love. It was being prescribed by a doctor, and one of the things that our first long-term medical director, a guy named William Terhune, said was, you've got to walk to town every single day. And so every day for years, through the 1960s into the 1970s, the patients at Silver Hill would go on a walk led by the medical director about 2 miles down Silver Mine Road into town, have breakfast in town, go shopping, say hi to people, and then walk back. And that was considered to be a part of their wellness. But I'd also like to think it was part of the whole community's wellness. And I'll just share one last piece to this. Chapin, you know this too, that one of the things you host in your church is what's called the early bird meeting. And that is for individuals who've had a history of addiction, who get together not just for their own benefit, but for the benefit of all the other men and women who join together. And I've been told by people who've been at meetings, AA meetings all across the country, that there's something special about that meeting here in New Canaan, which has been going on for a long time. I like to think Silver Hill has a little piece of that, but we don't run that meeting. That's run by the men and women who come to that meeting every single day. And that's pretty inspirational. So maybe there was a time when it was more veneer-based, but no more. I think we live in a kind of wellness community. We've been pioneers, really, in how do we do more of it. There's more to be done. And I think you inspire us, Julia, to think about how to integrate this in the medical establishment so that we as doctors aren't saying we've got all the answers, because we clearly don't. By working together, more of this can happen. So I think we've said a lot, so maybe if it's okay, I'll turn it back over to you, Julia, first. But then while Julia's speaking, maybe you guys can think of questions. I think we have a microphone. Somebody have a microphone? Great, thank you. And then we'd love to get your questions to any or all of us, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, well, I'll just say thank you for this. And I think we have the 3 ingredients of social prescribing right here. I mean, truly. I think you're absolutely right in recognizing that this is so essential to the work all 3 of you do. And that's what I'd heard over and over again. The new idea here is let's count it. Right? Those walks or those early bird meetings or the link working that you're doing. Let's get that in an electronic medical record, and let's show over time that this does really help, because that's how we get the cultural conversation, but also the investment, right? To recognize that the work you do is having real impact on some of our biggest problems in health and healthcare. And I'll just say, I mentioned this in the talk, but should have included a slide about it, that the very first social prescribing model in the UK, which Chapter 6 gets into, started in a church in the 1980s. And it was sort of taken over by this reverend who, was kind of put in this community. It was a pretty poor community. There were only 12 people in the church, and they were all over 70 years old. And so and they had 400 pounds, very little money in the bank. So he said, all right, let's focus on what matters to us. These people, they're older, but they have a lot of life wisdom. We may only have $400, but we have a beautiful grounds. We have a courtyard. We have this beautiful space. Let's focus on creating health. And to your point, reminding people of what, religious institutions have always done, reconnect people to their sense of purpose and reconnect people to each other. And so they started informally building their rebuilding the church really explicitly around these 5 ingredients, eventually started documenting the ways that this had all these profound health benefits, eventually got an on-site doctor to come. And now, that original model, it was called Bromley by Bow Church, has inspired, hundreds of others around the country. I agree, you are a link worker. So that's the next part of this puzzle. If not, a third space, if not an institution where actually the movement, nature, belonging happens, what works to help people reconnect to the organizations that are doing this work? How can we get that to healthcare? And that's with you. So I really do think, wouldn't you agree that we have all the ingredients to really make New Canaan a hub of social prescribing in the US? Because that's what it takes, is buy-in from all 3 levels here. And I'm just so honored to be here with you. I have a lot.
Thanks everybody
Thanks
for coming
everybody.
out tonight.
Thanks for being here.